All right. Yeah, hi everyone. So today we have the great pleasure of having Damien giving us a little bit of a tour of Protege, and in particular with an eye on the new features that we have in since Protege 5.6.1 that we're hopefully all using now. So thank you very much, Damien, for taking the time. And if you want, go ahead, share your screen and do your thing. Thank you.
Sure. So, do you see my screen?
Yes, we do.
Good. So, good afternoon to you all. Good afternoon or good morning or good night, depending on where you are. So, I've somehow become in the last few months maintainer of Protege ontology editor, which has no, actually that's probably the main difference in Protege 5.6, is that Protege is now a community project and no longer solely in the hands of Stanford University. And as part of this transition, I have become one of the Protege maintainer. You may have noticed that I'm the one who announced the release of Protege 5.6 and 5.6.1 a couple of weeks, well, a couple of months ago now. So as one of the Protege maintainers, I will today present you some of the main changes in the last version, and possibly, depending on the time, I would also like to highlight some not new features that already existed in previous versions, but features that may not be widely known and that you might want to know about. So, as I mentioned, Protege is now a community project. As such, here on these slides are the ways for you to contact the Protege community if you didn't already know them. The main way, the way to be favored for most cases is the bug tracking system on GitHub, which you can find here. If you are on the Obo Slack, which presumably most of you or all of you are, you can also use the Protege channel in the Obo Slack. And or if you are slightly more old-fashioned, you can also use the Protege's mailing list. So there are two of them. Protege users is mostly intended for, as the name kind of implies, user problems. So if you have questions about how to use Protege, and the Protege dev mailing list is mostly intended for developers, either if you have noticed a bug in Protege or if you have ideas on how to improve it or things like that. But I would like to insist that the main, the contact method to be favored is really the bug tracking system on GitHub. So regarding the changes in Protege 5.6 and 5.6.1, actually some of the main changes are purely technical ones. So changes that as end users, you should not really have to worry about. I will still mention them a little bit because they do have an impact on how you use Protege and what you can do with it. The main changes is that Protege used to require Java 8. We have now dropped support for Java 8, and instead Protege should work with any Java version between Java 9 up to Java 16. Java 17 is explicitly not supported for now, and we test it and ship it with Java 11. So if you use a version of Protege that is directly targeting your operating system, so if you directly download the Windows version, the Linux version, or the macOS version, it already ships with Java 11 included, so you should not have to worry about that. But if, for whatever reason, you use what we call the platform-independent version of Protege, that's a version that is not shipped with the Java runtime environment. So then you need to be aware of that because you need to couple that platform-independent version with a correct Java version. So between Java 9 to Java 16. Sorry. Another big changes for the users on macOS systems is that Protege can now run natively on M1 powered Apple computers, so what Apple calls Apple Silicon's CPUs instead of Intel CPUs. Previous versions of Protege could run on M1 powered computers, but they had to use what an emulation layer called the Rosetta emulation engine, which did allow Protege to run, but with some severe performance penalties, which are now completely lifted. Protege on M1 powered computers can now run natively. Sorry, okay, so I think there was a question in the chat, but I somehow cannot see it again. So whoever asked a question on the chat, if you can please re-ask the... Okay, so it was a mistake. Okay. Sorry about that. So, and then the last technical change in Protege 5.6 was an upgrade of the whole API, which is at the basis of Protege, which was upgraded from 4.5.6 to 4.5.25, which does not really change anything in the way you use Protege, but it has an impact in when you save your ontology file into some formats, especially when you save it into the obo format or into the whole functional syntax. The behaviors of some serializers in the whole API has changed between those versions. So this is something that has an impact on how you use Protege. Then another change that is noticeable in this version is that you're probably already aware that most of the time when you use Protege, you need to increase the amount of memory that is allocated to Protege, because the default amount of memory allocated to it is quickly insufficient to work with all except the smallest of ontologies. And so in Protege 5.5, there was different mechanisms to do that depending on the operating system you used. So there was one mechanism to use on Windows, one mechanism to use on macOS, and another mechanism to use on GNU Linux. So now all versions of Proteges across platforms use a single configuration mechanism, which is this file here, so the gvm.conf file, which uses the same syntax across all platforms. So this file should be located either in the .protege./conf directory in your user directory on your system, or if you have write access to the directory where Protege itself is installed, which normally is not a good idea, but on most systems you do have this access, then you can put this file directly inside Protege's directory under a conf subdirectory. On macOS, you just need to be careful that it's not directly under protege.app. There is an intermediate contents directory, which is an internal thing to macOS or shared by all macOS applications. So this gvm.conf file use a very simple key value syntax where you have 3 variables that you can configure. The most important value that you might want to configure is the max heap size, which is roughly the maximal amount of memory available to Protege. So it typically defaults to something around 1 GB. And as I've said before, to work with large ontologies, you really want to set that value to almost the largest value that you can afford on your system. So for example, on my machine where I have 16 gigabytes of memory, I typically set it to 12 gigabytes, or sometimes even up to 13 or 14 gigabytes, where I want to work with really, really large ontologies. The other parameters that you can configure here, the min heap size and the stack size, most of the time you should not have to worry about those. The min heap size is the initial amount of memory that is available to Protege. So basically, the amount of memory that Protege gets as soon as it is started. Most of the time, you should not have to bother with that. And same for the stack size. The only reason you could have to play with the stack size is if you have to use some Protege plugins that, for one reason or another, are limited by a too small stack size. But I'm not aware of any current plugins that have these limitations. Why would you even bother with min heap size? Nico is asking, why should we even bother with min heap size? That's a good question. In my opinion, there is no reason to play with min heap size. You can do it if you want. There is an option to do that, but I can't think of no reason to change the default setting of min heap size. The really important setting is the max heap size. So you should play with the other values only if you know for some reason that you need to play with them. Otherwise, don't bother with that. And regarding a previous comment from Nico that you should set the max heap size to around 2/3 of your total memory, just a bit of teasing. So where do you change the heap size? So yes, you change that in, so that's what this slide is all about. You change this value in the gvm.conf file that you will find either in Protege's installation directory, or if you do not have access to the Protege installation directory, some systems do not allow you to write inside an application directory, then you can create such a file in your home directory. You can create the .protege/conf directory if it does not already exist, and then you can write a gvm.conf file in which you can just write max heap size equals, and then whatever value you want to put here. And I just want to mention that in a future version of Protege, it will be possible here, instead of having to write the value as a number followed by M for megabytes or G for gigabytes, it will be possible in a future version to use a percent sign. You will be able to say, for example, 70%, and then Protege will automatically use 70% of the total amount of memory you have in your system, whatever that amount of memory is. But that is not possible yet. That will be for a future version of Protege. Any question on the configuration mechanism for the amount of memory available? No? Okay. So then Protege comes with a handful of plugins installed by default. And the main change here compared to the previous version is that ELK is now included in the standard distribution. So you no longer have to manually download and install the ELK plugin. You can now just install the standard Protege distribution, and you have ELK ready to use, ready to be selected in the Reasoner menu. If you want to install more plugins, the way to do that has not changed in previous version, but I will just, since we are talking about plugins, I will just mention a little bit how that works. You have basically two ways to install more plugins than the ones that are installed by default. You can do that manually by downloading the plugins jar file from the internet and then place it either in the .protege/plugins folder in your home directory, or again, if you have write access to the installation folder of Protege on your system, you can also put the plugins in the plugins directory inside Protege's directory. Or again, if you are using macOS, inside the protege.app/content/plugins directory. If you do that, the main difference between putting the plugins in the home folder or if you put it in the main folder is that if you put it in the installation folder directly, then it will be visible to all users of your computer if your computer is used by more than one user. So what happens if you have write access to the installed here? So basically, what happens if you put the plugins both in the per home for in the home.protege/plugins folder and also in the Protege's installation directory. So if a same plugin is found in the two folders, Protege will use the one found in the home directory folder. So that's one way to install a plugin manually by placing the jar file into one of those folders. You can also do it in a more automated way. If in the plugins configuration dialog, you enable the auto update checkbox here, automatically check for plugin updates at startup. If you do that, then every time you start, the first time you start Protege every day, Protege will automatically check on the internet for any plugins that you do not already have on your system, and it will give you a list of those plugins, and it will offer you the option to install them. And then you just have to select the plugins that you want to have installed, and Protege will automatically install them. So that to finish with plugins, so unfortunately, there are two issues, two plugins that are known not to work with Protege 5.6. So one is the Fact++ plugin, so that's a reasoner that you may have been using before. So the Fact++ plugin itself still works, except on M1 powered Apple computers. Because the Fact++ plugin, as the name kind of suggests, is written in C++, so it's compiled plugins. And as such, it does not work. The developers of Fact++ do not provide a version targeting M1 CPUs, so you cannot use that plugin on M1 powered computers. If you really need Fact++, there are workarounds to, you can basically force Protege to use an Intel targeting Java runtime environment. Then you will be able to use the Fact++ plugin at the cost of having, again, to use the Rosetta emulation layers that I mentioned before. So at a cost of downgrading the performances of Protege. If you are in this case, if you need to use Fact++ on an M1 machine, let me know and I can guide you through this workaround. But since it doesn't seem that nobody is answering Nico's question, it doesn't seem that anybody is using Fact++, so I can just skip over that. But don't hesitate to contact me, for example, if you are in the situation of having to use the Fact++ plugin, ask me how to use this workaround here. The other problem is the SparkQL query plugin that does not work at all. It's not specific to the M1 machines. It does not work at all with Protege 5.6 because of some incompatible changes in the underlying whole API. So if you need to run SparkQL queries within Protege, There's another plugin that you can try. That's the Snap SparkQL plugin, which is not installed by default, but you can install it using the system that I mentioned before. A downside of this Snap SparkQL plugin is that it does not support all the SparkQL syntax. I think actually it's limited to SparkQL 1.0. It does not support constructs that have been made available in SparkQL 1.1. So it's somehow more limited than the previous SparkQL query plugin. And if outside of Protege, so that's completely independent of Protege, but I mentioned it in case you need to run SparkQL queries. What I typically use in my case, I use a Python program called rdflib endpoint that you can use to basically fire a web interface allowing you to run interactive SparkQL queries. So again, if you are in this situation, that has nothing to do with Protege, but I'm happy to show you how it works, either now or in a later session or on Slack if you need more details about how to use that. And yeah, Nico, I agree about using robot query, but the problem with robot query is that every time you want to run a query using robot query, you need to load your ontology before robot can execute your query. And if you have a query that is already done, already written, and you know is already perfect, then it's fine. But if you are at the stage where you need to develop your SparkQL query, having to and if you're not, if like me, you are not able, you're not the kind of people who can write a perfect SparkQL query from the first draft, then having to wait for robot to load your ontology before the query can run can be quite annoying. So being able to run a query either directly in Protege or using an interactive interface such as rdflib endpoint is kind of useful, at least at the development stage, where you are still trying to write the perfect SparkQL query that you will then later on feed to robot. Because
can I just make a quick comment here on this point? I 100% agree with what you're saying. I just want to say that for this exact workflow, the way that I usually work is I just build the query generically either over the on2b Sparkle endpoint using Yascui or over Ubergraph without caring about the results at all. So just to get the syntax right and get some result from it, and then I just copy paste it into my let's say make pipeline with Sparkle and then execute it from there. That's a general setup.
Yeah, that's one way. So that works as well. The only problem that I have with that is that basically you're using an internet service just to do something that you could very easily using rdflib endpoint doing just locally on your machine. So for me, it's kind of inefficient, but that works. If you don't want to bother with installing rdflib endpoint or similar tools, you can also, of course, do that. That works perfectly fine. So then, leaving out the plugins issues and the issues of SparkQL queries, another big change in Protege 5.6 is the support for ID range policy files. So if you have ever used, especially ODK managed ontologies, which I'm assuming should be the case of most of you, you probably noticed, or you probably already are well familiar with those ID range files, which are typically located in the src/ontology file, basically just next to the edit file. But until now, previously, those ID range files were only ever used by basically human editors. This was the way for human editors to know what range was assigned to them. So what you had to do before, when you wanted to start working on an ontology, you ask the ontology, the person responsible for the ontology, to assign you an ID range. And then once you have an ID range, you read your ID range from that file, and then you manually fill that dialog here in the Protege settings. So you set the prefix, you set the number of digits, and then you set the lower and upper limits of your range. So now Protege 5.6 is able to automatically detect the presence of such an ID range file. And if it detects such a file, it will show you this kind of window with the list of all the ranges that are listed in the ID range file. And it will, you will then just have to select your range, the range that has been allocated to you, and you can then just click to use selected user, and then Protege will automatically fill this dialog here with the values found from the ID range file, so that you will no longer have to worry about filling those dialogue manually, which is especially useful if you are constantly switching between more than one ontology. For example, if you're, in my case, when I'm switched between FBBT, CL, Uberon, Arrow, and things like that. So, couple of things to know about this feature. Depending on your situation, you might even make it even more easier than it already is, because I invite you to look closely at this, what Protege is saying here at the top of this range selection window. Protege here is saying that it has found ID range policy file, but it could not find an ID range for the current user, which in this case is DPG44. That's my login name on this machine. Then please select the ID range that you wish to use. So what this means is that if the ID range contains a range which is allocated to the same name as the name you use as your login name on your computer, then Protege will not even show you that window. It will automatically use the range associated to your login name on your machine. So we can then, you open an ontology, and without having to select anything, Protege will automatically use the correct ID range assigned to you on that for that ontology. Which also means that if you are interested in these features, it might be worth it for you to go to all the ontologies that for which you are an editor, and change the value of the allocated to field in the ID range file to make sure that the allocated to value here matches your login name on your computer. Because then you can use that feature that Protege will automatically select the correct range without even asking you to select manually that range. So basically, by default, you still gain a lot of time by just having to select your range instead of having to manually fill it here. But if you are especially lazy, you can then make it even quicker by having Protege do everything automatically without having to select your range in your file. The downside of that is that there is a slight, maybe not the bug, but I'd say there is a slight incompatibility between the ID range feature and this remember last ID between Protege session feature. So I don't know if you have already used that feature. That feature is mostly useful if you work concurrently on several Git branches. For example, you want to add a term to an ontology, so you create a new branch for that. Then maybe you will submit a pull request to have your new term being added to the ontology, and without waiting for the new for your pull request to be merged, you switch to yet another branch to work on a completely different issue in which you will also add some new terms. When you do that, you want to make sure that the new terms that you will add across the different branches do not use the same IDs. And that is what this feature is about. This feature makes sure that even if you switch between Git branches, Protege will remember that in a previous branch, you have already used the next ID. And so in another branch, it will use another ID. Unfortunately, if you use the automatic assignment of ID range, then you can no longer, Protege will no longer remember the last ID it has used in another branch. So in my case, for example, that's not really a problem because in my workflows, I almost never work on several branches concurrently, at least not in the same ontology. But if you do have the habit of working on the same ontology, but in several branches, then it might be more important to you to make sure that Protege remembers the last ID it has used than to make sure that Protege automatically uses the correct ID range. So if you are in the situation where you have you work in several branches concurrently and you want Protege to remember the last ID it has used, then what you can do is that when Protege asks you here to select your range, you can just click cancel to basically discard whatever information is found in the ID range and basically instruct Protege to keep using the previous range it was using, because then it will remember the last ID it has used. Of course, you can only do that if when you switch between branches, you do not what you cannot do is work in a given ontology in a given branch, then switch to work on another ontology, then switch back to the previous ontology, but in another branch. Because then you will have to choose either you use the range selection feature to get back to the correct range, but Protege will not remember that it has used, it will not remember the last ID it has used. So it will be up to you to remember the last ID you have used, or you manually reassign your range, but then Protege will remember that it has used which IDs it has already used. So that might be a reason why you might not want, if your workflows involves working on several branches concurrently, you might want to preserve keep the possibility of declining the automatic assignment on range. So basically, you want to preserve the ability to click cancel here. And if you want to have that possibility, you should not configure your ID range to use your login name. Because if your ID range has the same name as your login name, then Protege will always automatically use your range without giving you the possibility to decline the automatic assignment. So inherent reason why, yeah, so so there's already a bug to track that. Basically, the reason it's the way this feature works. Basically, the remember last ID feature works by whenever you create a new term, internally Protege will update the lower limit of the range, so that when you switch to another branch, Protege will then, and you create a new term in another branch. Next time you create a term, Protege will ask for the next ID, and it will take the next ID from the next available ID in the range. But at that moment, the range is not the lower limit of your allocated range. The lower limit is the last ID that you have used. But when you use when this feature here is running, when you use when you automatically get an ID range from an ID range file, that will automatically reset the lowest limit of your ID range to the value that is configured in the ID range file. So basically, that will make Protege forget the last ID that has been used. So there is no easy fix for that. It will basically need to make the remember last ID and the automatic assignment of ID range work together. We basically need to redesign the way the remember last ID feature is working. So we already have a ticket in the Protege bug tracker to remind us of doing that, but I can make no promises as to when that will happen because we need to change the way this bit here is working completely. So we know we have to do that, so you don't need to submit a pull request for that, but no promises as to when it will happen or if it will happen at some point. So then for the remaining changes, so a very quick changes that might be useful, but that can easily pass unnoticed. You have this new small icon here in the hierarchy window, which is called jump to selection, which is useful if you are working on a particular term and if for whatever reason the term that you are currently editing is no longer within the range of the scroll view here, then you can just click on this jump to selection icon, and that will automatically scroll your hierarchy window up to the point that the term that you are currently editing is now back in view. That's it. Just to navigate quickly to the term you are currently editing if for whatever reason that term is no longer in view. Another change that you may have noticed already is that there are no more type of queries identifiers that are recognized as such and that are rendered as clickable links. So, for example, Wikipedia links, links to digital object identifiers and things like that. So you can now click on those queries, and depending on the type of queries, so depending on the prefix, it will. So, for example, this one will get you automatically to the corresponding Wikipedia page. This one will get you automatically to the corresponding paper or book chapters or whatever, and so on. Another quick change is that now when you're editing any kind of field and the value that you want to assign to that field is not a simple string, integer, date time, and Boolean data types are now on the top of the data type list because those four types are presumably the most commonly used data types, so you can now access them more easily rather than having to scroll the list to find the terms that to find the type that you want.
Can I ask, is there a way to configure this somehow, or is this something that the Protege developers decided?
That's hard-coded in Protege.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
If you want that to be configured, feel free to open a ticket for that. But for now, that's hard-coded.
No, just the reason why I'm asking is we are still kind of back and forth around the question of whether we should use date rather than date time for recording the creation date of a term, because these date timed strings, they are pretty, like, you know, large and annoying, let's say. But I was just curious, like, what would the process be? So I could, I guess, make my own PR to just add date to this top list there if I think that it is an important data type. But it seems weird that then everyone could go and say, but in my ontology, I need rational, or I need double or something, or float values or something like that.
Yeah. Then again, here the idea is just to make those types quicker to access. But for example, if you're looking for all rational, but here it's the next on the list. And so all types are always accessible. It's just that those 4 have been selected to be at the top of the list. So again, if you want to change that list or even make the list configurable, feel free to open a ticket for that. But that's really just to make users gain a fraction of a second to avoid having to scroll to get the types they want. All data types are still always usable. But I do get your point that if you want to promote the use, for example, of XSD date instead of date time, having date time here at the very top of the list instead of XSD date is a little bit annoying. So again, feel free to open a ticket if you want to change the let's say high priority data types. Another quick change is that obsolete entities are not shown by default. So there was always a feature of not showing obsolete entities. So the only difference is that by now this feature is enabled by default. So if you want to show obsolete entities in the hierarchies, so basically if you want to go back to the previous behaviors of Protege 5.5, then you need to explicitly select here display deprecated entities. Another change is that we have a slightly more sensible behavior in the class expression editor. So let's suppose here, for example, in this ontology, so that is FBBT, notice here that we have 2 terms that have coming from 2 different ontologies that have the same label. We have the cell term from the cell ontology, so CL0, and we have the cell term from the fly-based anatomy ontology, so FBBT 7002. So in the class hierarchy, they are distinguished by having the identifier next to them. That's the standard behavior of Protege in this particular case. But before, in previous version of Protege, when you have more than 1 term with the same label, it was not always clear in the class expression editor which term will be used when you start typing that term. So now that behavior has been made clear. The completion in the class expression editor will always use by default the term defined in the current ontology instead prior to any term defined in an imported ontology. So in this particular example, when I'm working on FBBT, if I start typing cell in the class expression editor, because I am in FBBT, the term that will show up here in the completion dropdown is the term from FBBT and not the term from CL, because the term from CL comes from an import and not from the current ontology. And slightly related to that, and that I think that's the last change that I wanted to mention today, you can now configure very precisely how entities are rendered in several places in Protege. So here I'm showing you for the example, I'm showing you in the class hierarchy, but this also affects other parts of Protege. So you can't. The default is to render entities by label. So that the render by label, where label is the RDFS label thing, which is most likely what most people would want. But you can also select to render entity by their IRI short name, so basically by their queries, which is what I've illustrated here. So in the case of LBBT, that's not really useful, but depending on the ontologies you are working with, especially in particular, if you are working with an ontology where your identifiers are not opaque, but are instead meaningful, then that might be useful. A slight variation of that is what we call the prefixed name, which is basically the same as the IRI short name, except that we also add the prefix just ahead of the identifier itself. And if you are not satisfied with that, you can actually select whichever property you want to use to display in the class hierarchy. So for example, here, I've done something that is probably not sensible at all, but just to illustrate. Here, I choose to render entities using the value of the RDFS comment annotation. I cannot think of any reason why you might want to use RDFS comment to display entities, but just to illustrate, you can use any annotation property that you might have available in your ontology. If for terms that do not have the annotation that you have selected, then by default, Protege will default to using the IRI short name, as you can see here for those two terms that do not have RDFS comment annotations. And lastly, for even more, you can even do things a little bit more complicated, but a little bit more customized. If you use custom rendering, you can actually select which annotations, in plural, which annotations you might want to use and in which priority you want to use them. So for example, here in this example, I've configured Protege to use first and foremost, the value of the IAO 589 annotation property, so that's the obo unique foundry label, and secondary to use the RDFS label. So what this means is that if the terms that Protege needs to display as an obo foundry unique label, so a 589 annotation, then Protege will use that value. If it does not have such annotation, Protege will fall back to RDFS label. And if we go back to my example that I've shown you before, in LVBT, where we have the two terms that have the same label, the cell term from CL and the cell term from LVBT, what I could do, and that is what I've done here in this particular example, that's not actually what is done in LVBT, but just for the illustration, I could add to the LVBT term an obo foundry unique label annotation, so IAO 589, which here is set to cell Drosophila. The point of this annotation, the obo foundry unique label, compared to the single RDFS label, is that the obo foundry unique label, as the name implies, is supposed to be unique not only across a given ontology, but across the entire obo foundry. So here, once I have done that, once I have added this obo foundry unique label annotation to the LVBT term for cell, and once I have configured Protege, as I've mentioned just before, then in the class hierarchy here, you can see that for the cell term from the cell ontology, Protege is still using the RDFS label, followed by the term identifier. But for the LVBT term, Protege here is using the value of the obo foundry unique label annotation. So that's, and of course here I've done that with just two different annotation properties, but there is no limit to the number of annotation properties that you want to use. So you could, for example, have a list here that will include first and foremost use obo foundry unique label if available, Then if no, if the term does not have an obo-foundry unique label, use RDFS label. If there is no RDFS label, then use, I don't know, for example, use the ID, then use the exact synonym or whatever. You can do things as complicated as you want them to be. One thing to note, and that is true both if you use the custom rendering or if you use any of the other rendering options here, is that whatever options you use for entity rendering has an effect on the class expression editor. The value that you use in a class expression editor to refer to a term must be what Protege is using to render the entity in all other places. So if, for example, here, in this particular example, if I have configured Protege to use the obo-foundry unique label when available, it means that in the class expression editor, if I want to refer to the availability term for CL, I need to use, I can no longer simply use cell only. I need to use cell parenthesis Drosophila, because that is the value that Protege is using to render the entity, because that's what Protege has been configured to do. So just keep in mind, and so same is true, for example, if you have configured Protege to use IRI short name rendering, then so basically AVBT underscore and whatever identifier value for the term. In the class expression editor, you will need to use LVBT underscore and whatever identifier value you need for the term. So the class expression editor basically is following whatever is configured for entity rendering. Is there a way to... Not sure. So Susan is asking if there's a way to stop Protege from changing the branch you are. When you are on a term that have more than one parents, that has more than one parental classes, you do not really have a control on which part of the hierarchy Protege will show in the hierarchy view. You do not control that, and I'm not sure myself what logic Protege is following. Whether I don't know if maybe it uses the first parent, or to be honest, I don't know what logic is Protege following here. But for now, there is no way to control that. So I know that's annoying, and I think there's already a ticket in the Protege bug tracker to track that issue. But for now, no, you cannot stop Protege from changing the branch that you are currently. If you arrive on a term using a particular path, Protege might switch to another part of the hierarchy because that term is also a subclass of another part of the ontology, and you do not control that. For now, you have no control on that particular behavior. Sorry about that. And yes, I think that's it for the changes that updates that I wanted to highlight on Protege. So I think we are already almost at the hour. So don't know if you have any more questions about what I've shown you today. Again, feel free to, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment that in the entity renderer, so one thing that I tried, I said it in the chat as well, is just to, since we are starting to introduce like language tags into some of our ontologies, so that you can actually use let's say you could theoretically edit your ontology in another language like French or Turkish. These are the ones I tried for HPO. And yeah, I was just wondering in my head whether these kinds of features could actually help with making ontology editing a little bit more inclusive moving forward, so that people that are, not so like familiar with let's say French, with the English language, maybe they can browse and deal with the ontology, or a lot of it anyways, in their own native language. So just as another option of the renderer.
So I don't think I've ever worked with an ontology that had multiple languages values. So to be honest, I did not even notice. But yeah, if you are working in a multi-language ontology, then it might be worth it to take some time to configure the display to make it more easier for you to work in your own language, if that helps, absolutely. And since we are 2 minutes to the hour, so I will not go into any details, but I will just want to highlight one particular thing, because I suspect it's a feature that is mostly unknown of Protege. You can actually configure quite precisely how you want Protege to how you want Protege to look like. And here, just to show you, I don't have any time to go into any details to show you how it's done, but don't hesitate to explore the Windows, the window menu of Protege to explore how you can personalize the graphical interface of Protege. So here, just to illustrate, this is a capture of what Protege looks like actually on my machine, where, for example, I display on the same tab all 3 types of hierarchies: the hierarchy for actual classes, the hierarchy for object properties, and the hierarchy for annotation properties. I show on the same tab the description of a term and the list of terms in which the list of classes in which this term is used, just to basically minimize the amount of time I need to switch from one tab to the next, just because I'm lazy. So if you spend your time working on Protege, I really invite you to take the time to explore how you can make Protege even more, even nicer to use, to really tailor the interface to suit the kind of tasks that you are doing most of the time. And that's it.
This was fantastic, Damien. So you see all the thank yous in the chat as well, but man, this was awesome. Thank you very, very much for this tutorial and all your work you put into this. This will be a great resource for the community moving forward. And I'm sure that when people get a hold of this video, they will ask you to present this again at the exact same tutorial at other venues. So this was really, really, really well done.